Good evening, everyone. I'm Dan Kurtz-Phelan. I am supposed to be a co-moderator of this event, but here is our second moderator. So we have a vast array up here on stage, and we will try to get to everyone. Sit. I don't think we need two moderators for this. Nightcaps, I think, are traditionally thought to be spiritually soothing and fortifying. The topic tonight is probably not likely to send you towards bed feeling better than you do now, but I think it's a useful reality check, especially from the American perspective, as we head into tomorrow's discussions about what happens in the war going forward. So I hope that our speakers will be blunt and data-based when they talk about the state of public opinion, again, especially in the US, where I think there's reason to be most concerned. And we will start there. Let's go to Senator Daschle first. You know more about the workings of US Congress and the Senate than almost anyone. Where is your level of concern, and do you see a prospect for sustained support for Ukraine in the months and years ahead?
Well, Daniel, I'd say the good news is that there is still broad bipartisan support countrywide. On that, there is very little doubt. I would say the numbers exceed 70% today, which in America, as polarized as we are, anytime you get 70 plus, you're doing pretty well. The problem we have is there's a growing isolationist trend, especially on the Republican side and the far right. And that isolationist trend is becoming more and more vocal, much more willing to exert their numbers to bring about a change in policy. And we're going to see in the next 3 weeks a very complicated set of circumstances that Daniel knows very well, having to do with the end of our fiscal year. We've got to fund the government on October 1st. And in that funding request for funding for all of the government, there are 12 different appropriations bills. The president is asking for $24 billion in additional aid for Ukraine. I will tell you tonight that at best, that request is 50-50, that we don't have any better than a 50-50 chance of passing tonight. I think ultimately we can get it passed, but I'm not sure we can get it done by the 1st of October. In fact, I'm quite sure we can't. I think we're going to see a government shutdown, and I don't know how long it'll last. Jim can talk a lot more about his prospects or his view of the prospects for that. But bottom line, and we have a lot of panelists and we want to give them all a chance to speak, I would say that we've got a lot of work to do in the House, especially to get the job done and ensure that the continuity that we've been watching was great pride and satisfaction over the last 18 months can continue.
Jim, let me go to you to pick up on that. You are work with many of the figures in the Republican Party especially, and a few in the Democratic Party who are most skeptical of sustained aid to Ukraine. You can see public opinion, especially on the Republican side, shifting. How worried are you about continued support? And looking backwards, you were just noting to me that you were on a panel a year ago called Ukraine Fatigue. It's been less than we feared. I think most people feared a year ago. But do you see that starting to creep into political dynamics in a way that it has not thus far?
Well, I'm concerned because I think that if you look at the history of any long-term engagement in war, you always get a level of frustration among the public as to, what are your measurements for success and when is our commitment going to be complete? And the recent history with our country in Iraq and Afghanistan doesn't leave a good feeling with a lot of Americans in terms of how that ended. I would agree with Senator Daschle's comments about where we are and the challenges we have with our complicated budget process and the dysfunctional nature, which doesn't have a lot to do with Ukraine specifically, but the dysfunctional nature of our budget process that plays into the politics with the election coming up next year. And that's what I would add that I think is important that we factor in. There are a lot of folks here that for the critical seminal moment in our nation and world's history, that this Russian invasion of Ukraine, I'm sad to say, is like third or fourth on their priority list, if they care. I mean, it's the elections next year, it's the economy, it's inflation, all these other factors. And so I was just talking with a former Hill staffer. In the last year plus, there have been 102 Republicans that have, if you look at the votes that have been cast at one time or another, have voted no on assistance to Ukraine. Now, there's still, I think, a good majority of House Republicans and a larger number of Senate Republicans, and I think House Democrats and Senate Democrats. But the fact of the matter is that this collective effort from 12 months ago when we talked about Ukraine fatigue must continue. The efforts that this collaboration, why the Yalta Economic Security Conference and all the participants, all of us who are in here, need to continue the effort. The brave Ukrainian, leadership that come to Washington have been very effective at lobbying the Congress. They need to continue that effort, frankly. And we need to put the human face on the horrific war crimes that Putin and I was in a conference in Stockholm 2 months ago, and I said, what Russia is, this is nothing more than a syndicate masquerading as a country. I mean, these are the Sopranos. And the more we expose the criminality of the actions of this Russian regime, people understand this, and I'll close on this note. And it was said earlier this morning by a number of our speakers. This is about, good and evil. And I don't know about our European friends, but for our American voters, they need to understand two things. It's about good and evil, and we're doing this because it's in our interest. This is our interest. I mean, if we don't stop Putin, and this is a relatively good dollar value when you talk about weakening Russia's military and stopping this where it should be stopped. And the brave Ukrainian people are making the sacrifices, believe me. But his plan is, I don't know, this in his mind, as Tom Friedman said this morning, getting in his head, whether he thinks he's a reincarnation of Peter the Great or whatever. Poland, Romania, and Eastern European countries have great concern, and they should, because if we don't stop it here, I think it leads to a real challenge down the road.
Let me just ask one somewhat pointed follow-up question. You speak to American voters probably more than anyone else here, and voters who are pretty far from Washington or New York or other places where Ukraine
far from
dominates,
Ukraine.
and far from Ukraine as well. Has that message continued to work as well as it did a year and a half ago? Do you get a sense that people are paying less attention, that eyes glaze over when you raise it with voters, or is that?
I think they're paying less attention, but I think the human face has to continue to be put on that, and then it becomes our responsibility. A year ago, I talked about the success that we had thus far in overwhelming support in the United States as well as in Europe. But I said, don't expect this to continue. People grow wary over long-term, look how long we were involved in Afghanistan and Iraq. And a lot of American people think, for what? I mean, what did we get out of that? And so they're asking the same questions now, which is why we need to continue to build upon the strategy that has been successful in the last 12 months, and that is putting the human face of this tragedy of this war in Ukraine and how it could implement all Americans next.
Let me go to Stephen next. It was noted earlier by, I believe, one of your colleagues that there has been striking cross-party support on Ukraine policy, and that even if there is a change in government in the coming months or years, we're not likely to see a dramatic shift in policy. Can you talk a bit about what, in your view, accounts for that, and what you and your colleagues, again, across parties have done to build that kind of support? What kind of narratives work? What do you think accounts for the success of that effort?
I think there's something that fundamentally has resonated with the British public about the Ukrainian experience, and it obviously goes back to our own history in 1940 and elsewhere. And I think the kind of both the leadership shown by the president, the kind of the tenacity and commitment of the Ukrainian people, the bravery of the armed forces. There's something very, very fundamental about that resonates with British people. I come from a military family. A lot of my family served in multiple generations in the British Army, in fact in the US Army as well. And for families like that might actually have been very, very divided on other issues, and we can think of a number of well-known topics in recent years that they were divided over. There is something about what is happening here that people not only recognise that there's a direct impact for Britain in terms of our own security and the security of NATO, the security of Europe, but something fundamental in the sort of the human experience. And Jim talks about sort of that good and evil battle, just the fundamental moral question that is being determined here in Ukraine, not just for Ukraine, but for all of us. And I think that resonates very strongly with the British people. But you're absolutely right. I mean, there is a remarkable degree of sort of actually multiple partisan sort of agreement on this in the UK, and it is matched in the public. There are pretty brutal and polarised debates in the UK at the moment, not quite at the level of the United States, but not far off it. And Boris Johnson, as someone who's very, very popular here, he's someone I agree on very, very little about, but he took the right choices when it came to Ukraine. There's been an incredible amount of cross-party cooperation behind the scenes and in public on this, and it is genuine. I mean, it's very much there. Something that can unite Labour, the Conservatives, the Scottish Nationalists, and the Liberals is unique. So I feel more optimistic about the situation in the UK. I feel more optimistic about the sort of the durability of it. But I would say two big buts. Firstly, in an election year, similarly, the voters go rightly to their domestic priorities, and international issues, even Ukraine, are not high amongst those. It is the top three at the moment. Obviously the economy, secondly our public services, issues around the health service and so on, and thirdly some wider and complex debates around immigration and migration. Those debates don't necessarily conflict with their support for Ukraine, but they very much dominate the domestic discourse. And the last thing I would say, though, and this is a particularly strong worry of mine, is that there are fringes, both on the extreme right and on the extreme left of UK politics, that are taking some very strident anti-Ukrainian positions for either ideological or historical reasons, but also for other reasons to try and exploit things. I saw this recently in my own hometown, a small town in South Wales, where a far-right grouping tried to organise massive protests against Ukrainian refugees in that town. Now, the good news is that the people of that town resolutely rejected this and expressed their support for Ukraine. But the fact that they thought that there was a possibility that they could use this as a wedge issue, that they could raise these concerns and play on people's fears about how long this will go on, how long refugees will be present, what this is costing and so on, did worry me. So I think we just need to have that voice in the back of our heads all the time to avoid those extremes.
A quick question, if you don't mind. For those of us who are history buffs and try to understand what occurred in World War II and previously, I'm wondering if the support, the overwhelming support in Britain, is in part by, and it was said today again, this comparison of Zelensky as a Churchillian-like figure. And I wonder whether or not that is part of the resonation. I mean, I think we in the U.S. who know that partnership and how critical it was between FDR and Churchill have this nostalgic view of why that was part of the success. Do the English people do they think of that comparison with Zelensky? And
no, they absolutely do. They absolutely do, and they do see it. And I can tell you, one of the most powerful moments I had in my entire time in Parliament in the last few years was when President Zelensky came and addressed both houses of Parliament in Westminster Hall, which is, almost 1,000 years old, has had every great event in British history. And he stood there and captivated a room of all parties, MPs, lords, staffers, everybody. It was almost a religious moment in what is a very significant building, and I've not seen there may be one or two people who have done this historically in recent times, and it very much is there. And Churchill is an unusual figure because, again, he was a conservative, then a liberal, then a conservative, then headed a coalition government with Labour in it. So that ability to reach across political boundaries and across different backgrounds, it is absolutely there, and that personalism of the message, I think, has really cut through.
Let me shift to the continent now and go to Ben and Damien to talk a bit about their voters, but also this question. I think people watching in the U.S. a year and a half ago thought that the far right and in certain extent the far left would present greater challenges to sustain support and would have a greater influence on policy. That does seem like a dog that didn't bark so far. But what is your level of concern? What do you see coming in terms of, again, the sustainability of support? Ben, let's start with you.
Yeah. Well, first, I think we have to look at the glass half full. The glass half full is that we're here a year and a half into the war, and I think everyone in this room would have been, it was certainly my case, extremely concerned on February 24th that maybe a few months, a few weeks into the war, we'd lose focus, we'd lose interest, national interest would, and selfishness would start taking over. And that was clearly Putin's gamble. It still is Putin's gamble that there's a moment we're going to lose focus. And the story of France is very similar to the ones we've heard so far, which is that public opinion support for Ukraine is still wide and steady for delivering weapons, for Ukraine's integration within the European Union and NATO. And even beyond that, the focus is still there. I'll give you just one example that's very striking. We have 3 24-hour news channels in France, like in the United States. One of the 3 has decided to shift to full 24/7 Ukraine coverage with a very constructive and very positive coverage of the conflict. They've gone from struggling between number 2 to number 3 to number 1 channel in the news. Magazines, newspapers, you still see Ukraine in the headlines on a regular basis, and you still see it with a positive outlook. And my experience as an MP has been generally that everyday voters tend to be much less cynical about Ukraine and Russia than the French elite. You see in the French elite, and especially on the far right, but unfortunately in France not only, you also have former heads of state, you also have intellectuals who will argue that we shouldn't go too far, there's a risk of escalation, that Russia, after all, is our ally. And when you talk to voters, basically, even if it's not the top of their concern, which, of course, in France, like everywhere else, is the economy, purchasing power, security, crime, but still, there's a very basic understanding that there's an aggressor and a victim, and you help the victim to win against the aggressor. And I think that's very striking. And I think that has put, to a certain extent, and this is where maybe I'll look at the glass half empty, let's put the far left and the far right a little more on the defensive. Clearly, Russia's aggression on Ukraine has hurt dramatically Marine Le Pen's campaign last year against Emmanuel Macron, as well as the other far-right candidate, Éric Zemmour. They're both supporters of Russia. And today, they are on the defensive. We've had 3 resolutions of support for Ukraine passed at the French Parliament. One was a general resolution. The other one was a resolution calling Holodomor a genocide. And more recently, we called Wagner a terrorist organization. And these were all passed almost unanimously, and including by the far left and the far right. But of course, I'm concerned, like everyone else, about coming fatigue. And I think here I'll echo what Congressman Costa was saying. It's very important to make the case and to continue to hammer the case that supporting Ukraine is about defending our own French national interest. Ukraine defends the eastern flank of NATO. Russia is going after French interest. There are coups right now in Burkina Faso, in Niger, directly against French interests and French security, with people brandishing Russian flags. With Wagner, we don't know what will happen with it now, but with Wagner leading disinformation campaign against French influence. So we're defending our own interest. When we call Wagner a terrorist organization, it's about as much as solidarity with Ukraine as it is about our own security concern. If we want inflation to be tamed, if we want the war to end, then give Ukrainians the means to win this war towards victory. And that is the only way that not only will we have peace and freedom on our continent, but we'll also have our security interest better protected.
Damon, let's go to you. And should note for those who aren't tracking this closely, that the AfD is now polling second in Germany and seems to have momentum behind it at this moment.
Yeah, absolutely. But I want to go back to what you said in the beginning to look at numbers as well. And so I did check the numbers a bit before the panel, and I did it for the European Union because I still sit in the European Parliament. And I think it is quite positive if you look at it. Like the support for sanctions and the basic support also for weapon delivery is still stable. It's sometimes slightly declining, but it's stable across the Union. And what made me very happy is also the percentage of people that believe that Ukraine should just give up territory to get to a peace agreement is declining. 10% actually in Germany, and I think Italy and France over the last year. 8%. Okay, 8%, but roughly in that category across Europe. So in some big countries, and I think that is positive. But I have to also obviously agree that these two factors, complacency on the one side, which you can I think also see, for example, in how much money we are giving now. I mean, 50 billion euros sounds like a lot of money that the European Union is pledging for the next 4 years, but it's 4 years. And we were pledging 18.9, I think, for this year, no? So you can see in terms of budgetary support, we're not getting better and stronger. And I think also when you look at weapons delivery, it has always been not that strong. And that brings me to the second point, which is the fringes, the far right and far left, and maybe also Germany. I mean, Germany started from a very peculiar position of being economically extremely tied to Russia, and also actually culturally for some groups in the German elite and not even elite that had like very close relationships. And I think we did a great jump, and this is also not let's say, also thanks to Ambassador Melnik. I don't know if you ever followed him in Germany, but he definitely woke up that complacency and pushed, and I think there was some good movement there. But there is still a mix of people who think like this war should really not be happening, but in a way that is not, saying we should support Ukraine. And I think there's also differences in East and West, for sure. And then maybe to the question of the fringes, there would go on the European level again. I mean, AfD 23% is absolutely shocking. If you look at the Sweden Democrats, the True Finns, I have to say also French elections, Marine Le Pen is still extremely scary to me. I mean, Meloni in Italy got a bit more careful, but these people have populistic tendencies and, if you look at Orban, also autocratic tendencies. And they will always ally with autocratic leaders, because it's just more comfortable to have someone that doesn't say, hey, what about your rule of law? And just wants to give you some oil or gas. Yeah, so I think we're, for the short and maybe medium term, we're okay. And I think if you look at European Parliament resolutions, almost every plenary, we have a resolution about the urgency to help Ukraine. But there are tendencies which could be worrying.
Sylvie, I don't want to typecast you, but you can usually rely on journalists to give us a bracing dose of pessimism. That doesn't have to be the tenor of your remarks, but as you step back, you've observed similar dynamics in other contexts. You bring a historical perspective to this and can look a little bit beyond those who are engaged in the day-to-day of winning elections and passing legislation. Do you share the glass half full perspective that I think we've gotten from most people up here?
No, I agree. I think you would have asked me the question last year. I would have been much more pessimistic. I thought the winter would be tough, and I thought there would be Ukraine fatigue, but it didn't happen. And of course, the French have other concerns, but for instance, one indication is our readership. Benjamin mentioned the TV news channels, but at Le Monde, we can't give them enough coverage of Ukraine. It's amazing. We have reporters and photographers rotating here, and we have long stories, short stories, I mean, all kinds of, we do front page on Ukraine every other day, and our readers really are really, really very interested. So that's really a strong indication, I think. And how long will it last? I don't know, but the fact is that also people don't have don't seem to be concerned about the cost, the economic or financial cost. I think they have no idea of how much money is spent, and they probably assume that it's the European Union which is paying for it, and they don't realize that France is also contributing to the European Union budget. But so anyway, so there's no this concern so far, and so I think it's pretty encouraging. There are two. Why is there this level of support? I think there's a historical dimension, which, I mean, I think we're still in a generation which has some memory, not direct memory, but memories of the of World War II, and the fact that borders are being so blatantly violated. You know, it strikes a chord in Europe. It's really on the continent. I mean, France is farther than Germany from Ukraine, but still, it's the sacrality of borders is something which really is important in continental Europe, I think. And yes, the resilience and the resistance of the Ukrainian people is really something which people in France are quite admirative of. And Bucha was obviously a very important factor, including for Macron, because Macron at the beginning was not so firm in his support, and you know, he was withering about whether Ukraine should be given the candidate status or not. And he made this big jump in June, and I think, you know, the spring was very, very, the events in Ukraine in the spring was very important. So yeah, I think this is quite strong at the moment. Something is coming, which is the debate about the enlargement, and that will be very difficult, I think, and nobody has any idea. I mean, I don't know what Carl thinks about. I mean, I have an idea of what Carl thinks about this, but I think we have to be more realistic about what's going to happen, and we have to prepare the public opinions, because this is going to be very, very challenging, to say the least. Yeah.
Let me go to the two people up here who I think have a better grasp on the data than anyone else, and then I want to circle back to you, Senator Daschle, before we go to comments from others in the room, to talk, and I'm giving you fair warning, but with apologies, to talk a little about Donald Trump and the presidential election and how that might factor into both dynamics in Congress over the next year, but also what that might mean for U.S. policy if you look ahead a couple of years. But let's go to Carlo first to tell us the extent to which the data does back up the somewhat more impressionistic sense we've gotten from others, and where you see the trends going.
I mean, everyone is talking about the glass half full, and maybe it's a wine glass, so I allow myself to pour a bit of water into the half full wine glass. I think the schizophrenic situation is that I would say, yes, the majority of Western voters wants Ukraine to succeed, wants a Ukrainian victory. But nevertheless, we're running into a war fatigue. And in Germany, for instance, there has been also attempts to exploit the situation by the conservatives, by the CDU, which is the biggest opposition party. I mean, it's not only the far right or the far left, which we do have, which is very vocal anti-Ukrainian. There is still a lot of opposition in the Social Democratic parliamentary group, because after, let's say, after the historically more pro-Russian fraction within the Social Democratic Party was told to shut up for a while, they're now coming back. In the CDU, the party leader, Friedrich Merz, as I said, the biggest opposition party right now, leading the polls if there would be national elections by tomorrow, has tested the water to what extent he could basically go on a slightly, you know, anti-Ukrainian course in his party. He failed. The problem is, at least for Germany, but I would support this hypothesis also for Italy and Spain and Portugal as far as we know the data, even for France and Great Britain, the big narrative is missing. And what everyone has said is, you know, I mean, we're discussing the support of Ukraine in terms of what kind of weaponry do we deliver. So we're discussing about the F-16, the Taurus, so things people are not that much interested. In Germany, for instance, for the first time, the majority of German voters is against the delivery of Taurus, with the missile. Yeah. So when we go back half a year ago, when it was about the Leopard tanks, Germany was split. Now, majority of voters is against the Taurus. Why? The point is that we are missing the narrative why it is important to support Ukraine. We are down to discussing weapons delivery, and of course, if people hear that the Taurus, can fly and hit targets over 500 kilometers, and then the far right comes, and even the Chancellery comes and said, we are concerned that they will hit certain targets in Russia. Everyone is thinking about an escalation. The Germans especially have the so-called German angst of the nuclear escalation. Putin knows this and is playing very well with the fears of the Germans. And politicians from all parties who are still supporting Ukraine have missed basically the chance to explain to people why it's important to defend Ukraine. And it's much more about what kind of weapons you have to deliver. What we need is a debate about the political goals. What do we want to achieve in Ukraine, and what are we ready then to deliver? And it's exactly this political debate is missing. So if you ask the average German voter what his government wants in Ukraine, he can't answer because the government is shying exactly away. And this basically makes the support of a vast majority who wants Ukraine to succeed fading away, because of course the way the media portrays also the counteroffensive, it's not going well because we're looking only at territory. So right now Ukraine has conquered 1% of the territory back, which of course sounds ridiculous. So because we don't have specialized journalists who know how basically counteroffensive are made and what is important. So people are exhausted. They think nothing, works in Ukraine in terms of the counteroffensive. They don't know what the political goal is, what the end state is, what do we want to achieve, and therefore they're running into a Ukraine fatigue. And then, of course, as everyone said, there are other problems. Companies have high energy prices. We are discussing illegal migration, social security. This is what people, are concerned of, and we're losing it. My hypothesis is we're losing it in Germany. And if we lose it in Germany, because I still think Germany is extremely important. If Germany changes the course, other European countries will follow. And that's my biggest concern. I'm not talking about France. I'm talking about the smaller European countries.
Stefan, let's go to you. That's a good segue to your analysis.
To follow. First, public opinion in Europe is much more stable than political elite, almost everywhere. And in fact, the increase of the level from the political elite follow the level of support from the public opinion, and it's not the contrary. It's not the public opinion which follow the politician, it is the contrary with what happened. 75% of the French consider that Russia is the bad and the aggressor. The hope for the winning of Ukraine is 89%. Of course, then there is an issue, which is that there was a dream, because we have no soldier on the field, that this war could be won without cost. Money is an abstraction, and the rest didn't exist, because for a long time, especially in France and Germany, our support in terms of weapons was what it was. Okay, so there was this idea that, in fact, you can have a very modern war where you win without any cost. No soldiers, no money, no military support. So, of course, when you discover, and when your public opinion discovers that there is a cost, you have an issue, and it's logic. So I follow him for that, which is that if we don't explain that, in fact, there is no victory without cost, but the victory of Ukraine will open a fantastic moment of development for Europe. There will be investment, because Ukraine, everybody will understand that Ukraine will be part of Europe. There will be not just reconstruction, there will be a new wave, I will say, a new stream for Europe, and that it is the interest of business community, it is the interest of the government, it is the interest of Europe, of France and Germany especially, to be part of that, to lead that. Second things, it's a question of time. There is a rationale coming from partly from politicians and in France some pseudo-intellectuals who explain that time is the best allies of Russia. And this narrative exists to say, you know, if the war is long, it's terrible because time is the ally of Russia. Why? First, Russia, it is the GDP of Spain. Used to be, it's less today. So do you think that Spain could win a war against the entire world? I mean, because in fact allies of Russia are not so engaged with Russia that it is on the Western world. Second, from a military point of view, Russia loses more weapons than they receive or create. I mean, they have still a lot of ammunition, a lot of classic tanks, and they have still aircraft. But for the rest, and especially if you are looking at the missile, they use and they consume much more missile than they can produce or receive. Which means that the perspective is that Russian army is weaker and weaker, even if they learn from the beginning, of course. When Ukrainian army, I mean, never forget that, Ukrainian army starts from nowhere. I mean, there was no Ukrainian army in 2014. And then the Ukrainian army in 2022 was with no modern weapons because all of us, we didn't give them modern weapons because we have the fear that the Russia winning the war will capture those weapons. So they learn now, they receive tanks 6 months ago. Aircraft, not yet. Missile, few months ago. And sometimes it was the special force from the Brits who did it and not the Ukrainians themselves. So it means that you don't transform a small army in an army able to win against the Russian in a few weeks. But time is our ally because Ukrainian army become stronger and stronger with our support, and Russian army become weaker. And then you see where is the issue of the Putin narrative. It is to create the European fatigue. It is to make a bet and to gamble on the election of Trump or on what will happen maybe in Italy, in Hungary, in Slovakia, and so on. Because he has to make happen that times become again his allies for political reasons, what he can't do today.
If we had more time, I'd ask you to name the pseudo-intellectuals, but we'll save that for another occasion. Senator Daschle, let's talk about Donald Trump a bit.
Well, Donald Trump has decimated virtually every political norm our country has established in 250 years. That's simple. He's been indicted now on 91 counts, and his favorability has gone up over that time. 8 out of 10 Republicans now support his reelection. The polls are even at 45% now in virtually every poll that's been released in recent weeks. We'd have to go all the way back to 1892 to find a time in our American history when a former president ran against an incumbent president. So over 100 years. I think there are 4 factors driving Trump's popularity. First and foremost, it's this isolationism that has now been growing, and this populist movement that's especially evident on the Republican side, on the far right. It's growing, it's becoming more palpable, and they're far more assertive now than they were even 4 years ago. So that's number one. Number two, others have said it this morning, but I think there is a growing sentiment in our country in favor of autocracy. And Trump epitomizes, personifies autocracy. Trump has made no secret of the fact that he in many cases identifies with Putin. In fact, he was given an opportunity once he was asked, I'm sure people remember, do you support or do you believe what the CIA has told you about something, or do you believe what Mr. Putin has said? And he said, I understand, I believe Mr. Putin. And so he has made it pretty clear. Autonomy is something that he believes is good for our country and the globe, and he has increasing number of followers in that regard. The third thing that I think that is a factor, and I'm sure it's a factor in all countries, but social media and cable news gives him the megaphone that no other predecessor has ever had. He's able to dictate to Fox News and to the social media sites his message, his narrative, and there are people who are only consuming that news today. And with all the misinformation around those social sources, it becomes even more palpable. And then finally, I think there are many people, because of Trump's popularity in the Republican Party, who are desperately fearful of taking him on or seeing any space between him and them. They're fearful of him. They don't want a primary. They don't want to get beat in the primary. And in elections in America today, in most cases, it's the primary, not the general, that's more important today. So more and more people are falling in line simply because they don't want a primary. For all those reasons, I think we're in for a very, very close race all the way through the next 14 months between now and next November.
Sylvia, let me ask you a follow-up question. If you did see a sharp shift in U.S. policy on Ukraine in 2025, how would European policymakers react?
I don't know. I think they are preparing. I mean, everybody's obsessed by this thought in Europe at the moment, yeah. Now, how will they react? I'm not sure. I would like to think that it will strengthen the EU, but you never know with the EU. That would be the logical thing, but you know, it also depends about how France and Germany work together again in the context of this enlargement issue. So I'm sorry, I don't have a clear answer to this.
Yeah, Ben, you wanna take that on?
Look, I think it will be a major test for transatlantic relations and for the future of Europe. What's clear is that none of us can now pretend that what happened in 2016 was an accident of history or parenthesis and that we could go all back to normal. And there was a major denial, I think, on both sides of the Atlantic about this. What's so striking about the Republican primary is, of course, you have Trump, who's 50 points ahead, but then you have Ramaswamy and DeSantis, who on foreign policy are pretty much echoing what he's saying, especially on Ukraine and Europe. I think there's a few lessons we have to draw from this. First, Ukraine is on the European continent. The Biden administration, I think, has done an extraordinary job at providing transatlantic leadership and at supporting Ukraine. But at the end of the day, it is our responsibility. It's on our borders. I think this is why the French, Germans, and others care so much, because I think deep down they know it's only a couple hours away on a plane. And so in the long run, we have to be in a place where we could provide the kind of support that we're providing for Ukraine without the United States. We are definitely not there yet. Definitely not. Of course not. But it's going to be a major test. And I think the test starts now. President Macron, especially in the last few months, has been very clear that he supports Ukraine's integration into NATO and the EU. And you know, he's always had a vision of European strategic autonomy. The European has to take ownership of their own security. And there's no better way to advocate for this than to clearly signal to your friends in Central Europe and Northern Europe who are threatened by Russia that it's our threat too, and that we include this threat in our vision of European sovereignty. Because otherwise, and I'll finish there, what will happen is the Trump administration will basically say, look, we'll cut bilateral deals with any European country that will buy our stuff and spend defense, and will abandon NATO. And some countries might be tempted to do this. I think it's very important that we hold a line, that we keep European unity, and it starts now to already be able to prepare the future.
May I say, yeah, because it's much more an issue for the Germans than for the French, yeah.
I think I would agree, and I would add that, you know, the most important thing to get Ukraine over the winter in the next phase of the war is that the industrial base of support will be set up. And this mainly is a European thing. This mainly is a European thing. I mean, the Americans can do something, but it won't be sufficient if the Europeans don't set up the industrial base to support on a constant basis Ukraine with ammunition, with spare parts, artillery, and whatever. So we're not talking about the special gadgets like F-16 and Taurus missiles. We're talking about the simple stuff they need to get over the winter to keep the Russians on the move, because otherwise, you know, the next spring offensive will be a disaster. So, and this is a European task. So whatever happens in the US, we have to get our guts together, because otherwise Ukraine will be in deep misery, militarily speaking.
There's an impression in the US that Europe has been slow to get moving on the defense industrial front. Is that a fair characterization, and has that changed?
Well, it's an extremely fair characterization. On the ammunition part side, we are now stepping up, but the rest still is too slow. The rest still is too slow. And I mean, honestly, you know, if the US goes now into the presidential race and will probably slow down with the support of Ukraine, probably, then this will be another wake-up call for the Europeans to get into gears. And this is a chance the European Union and the single European countries, especially Germany and France, and also Great Britain, I mean, have to take to get this industrial base running, because otherwise we all will be in a deep problem.
Let me ask a question here, though, because I've had this conversation with my European colleagues, with the European Parliament for some time now, and it deals with national security and it deals with climate change. I've told my friends in Germany and Italy that it was just a bad idea, and we know how it originated, to be dependent upon Russia for your energy. And wow, has that come home to be proven true. Now, we overcame a difficult winter in Europe and in Ukraine, and we did a lot to move liquid natural gas and other things to try to make it less severe as possible. We're coming upon another winter. President Zelensky said this morning very clearly it's going to be difficult. They're going to have blackouts. They're going to have challenges there. But when Europeans care, has there become an awakening of sorts? I mean, France is in a different situation. They've plotted their own course to their credit. But with climate change, which is a concern of Europeans and Americans, that, gee, this war in Ukraine is not only about our national security, but it's about our energy security. And it's about the concerns we have about climate change. I mean, are these issues resonating among Germans and Italians and those that up until 18 months ago thought this was a pretty good deal we had with Russia?
Let's go to Stephen and then Damien, and then Carl, can I ask you to wrap up on enlargement and any other reflections you have after hearing this?
Yeah, I guess one comment and a question for our American friends. In terms of the cooperation across Europe, and one of the unique things that's happened, I think, in the UK is that Brexit notwithstanding, actually there is a discussion, an active discussion about close foreign security and defence cooperation beyond NATO. NATO, obviously, the bedrock of everything, and that goes without saying, and it goes without saying for my party, but also a clear strategic dialogue with our European Union colleagues on those issues, because unless we have that foundation to cope with possible, turbulence in the Atlantic relationship, then whether it's on industrial cooperation, whether it's on sanctions policy, whether it's on strategic foreign policy decisions, and by the way, not just in relation to Ukraine, but also the Western Balkans and other key challenges we might face in the Sahel. And that's one of the conversations I've certainly been having across Europe, and it's opened up a new discussion in the UK, and possibly one that we wouldn't have even been able to have, 6-7 years ago. So I'm optimistic that there is a potential for a new chapter in UK, EU, and sort of through other forums like the EPC and so on. I had a question for our American colleagues. In terms of the China question, I recently met with a bipartisan congressional delegation in the UK, and very, very clear top topics: China, Ukraine, and then questions about Northern Ireland protocol, which thankfully we've now moved into a much better place on. But do people fully understand that strategic question that if we do not ensure a Ukrainian victory, the signal that sends elsewhere in the world? I mean, the chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan and that signal that sent both to Russia and to China, is that fully understood, including on the other side of the House and the Senate?
Well, I think it's complicated. I don't think they focused on it. So the short answer is no. I don't think they've made that connection. And I think there are probably many and a fairly significant percentage of people that don't care, even if they did know. And so I think we have a lot of work to do. I think it's a very important case to be made, and people have made it throughout the day-to-day because I think it does affect us. I don't think we've done as good a job as we need to do in making this all relevant to the American voter. And that's part of it, making that relevant and understanding better what these connections really are for the American people is something that we've got a lot of work to do over the course of the next year and before the next election.
Damien?
Yeah, just two very quick comments, and the first one is like I'm a budget politician, so not foreign policy expert, but if I look at and I talked about it, the EU-Ukraine facility, if there was no funding from the US, there would be roughly enough for a year, and we have planned it for 4. And then you didn't even calculate in IMF and all the other support elements that the US has. So like if you just look at budget, I mean, a cut there would be horrifying and would really cost a lot. I mean, we talked about the cost. The second point is on Germany and how we would react. I mean, to be honest, this famous Zeitenwende speech of Scholz, where he said like we're going to change our approach. What happened after reminded me of the German-American conference in Harvard at some point, where the theme was leading from behind. And I still, first of all, I find it a very weird theme to choose. And second, that doesn't work anymore. You know, like if Germany still waits until everybody else is ready to then maybe send a tank, this won't work if we have a US that's not there anymore. And I'm not sure that the current chancellor is willing or able to go in that direction. And so, I mean, I would be very surprised to see, or like very, let's say, hopefully it won't happen, but to see what will happen in that case with German leadership.
Before we go to Carl Bildt, we have one Ukrainian member of parliament here who, I think there's a mic right next to you, yeah.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the panel and your support, and we as Ukrainians really appreciate it, and we know we would have made it without each one of you and your country standing behind us. But I just have a very I don't know, it's not probably a simple question. So everybody keeps talking about support. I hear about launching the production of 155 caliber, but let's be honest, it's going to be replenishing of your own stocks. It's not going to go to Ukraine. And your people are very direct about it. Second, we hear about the 50 billions for 4 years to Ukraine. That means $1 billion per month. That's less than it is now. So let's be honest and let's tell your people, your countries that we're cutting down the support for Ukraine. And we as Ukrainians that are vulnerable now, we calculate, we understand that, and we feel it's our pain, because it means when we don't receive the tanks in time, it means more people are going to die. I honestly have 5 close friends already. It's not the people that I know from Facebook. My close friends who are widows now, my age, and I lost my best friend at war. For us, it's personal, and I understand you're talking about politics, but there is one thing that I want you to answer. What if Ukraine loses? Because we all keep talking about whether it's success about 1 kilometer, and I know how many lives were put for this 1 kilometer. I understand that strategically and geopolitically it seems different, but I just want you to start talking to your voters, to people who support you, to your governments, and ask them, what if Ukraine loses? And be honest, saying, we're not giving additional 50 billion, we're cutting down the finance for Ukraine. Thank you so much.
We could spend an hour responding to that, and probably should, but we are at time, and I don't want to keep people late since there's a full day
Let
tomorrow.
me,
so
let me just answer the question,
Okay,
I think, and I
okay.
don't pretend to speak for all of us, but I've said this repeatedly for the last 18 months. If Ukraine loses, and member of the Ukrainian parliament, Sasha Usanova, your question really bottom lines it, because you're literally the pain and suffering, you expressed that in a more meaningful way than any of us could articulate. If Ukraine loses, we will have failed. We will have failed the test of our time for Western democracies, because the ramifications of Ukraine's loss of this war, a Putin victory, I could only begin to try to calculate what that would mean for Europe, what that would mean for rules-based economy, what signals that would show to China and other autocrats. It would mean that historians, in my opinion, 10, 20 years from now would look back at this time and said that when it was our time to meet the test for Western democracies, we failed. And therefore, President Xi's comments that he makes to President Biden in the last 2 years that Western democracies are on the decline would prove to be true. That's what I think is the bottom line. If Ukraine loses this war, we all lose. But the problem is that I think too many of our constituents don't understand the failure and the losses that we will all suffer in ways that we cannot even begin to calculate.
Carl, can I hand it over to you to wrap up as co-moderator?
Well, I can do that. Just to say that I think it's wrong to say that our support is declining, and that the production that we are doing now is just to replenish our own stores. I mean, just take my own country as an example. We delivered 15,000 anti-tank weapons. I didn't know that we had 15,000, and we no longer have, because we've not been able to replenish. The Americans delivered a further 10,000 of those, so significant numbers. We have delivered all of the Hawk missiles we had. We don't have any left. We have delivered all of our AMRAAMs. We don't have any left. We are producing ammunition as fast as we can, not as fast as we would have liked to do, because nowadays artillery ammunition is somewhat more complicated than it used to be 20 years ago. So it takes some time to ramp up production. So we have significantly, at Sweden and the Nordic world I can talk about, significantly increased support, both military and financial. It is going to shift in character somewhat. And it's not going to be the big weapon systems, F-16s and whatever, that's going to happen. That gets publicity. It's, if I look at the latest packages coming out of the Nordic world, it's more spares, repairs, maintenance, training, because we find that was lacking, and that's needed in order to sustain the systems that have already been delivered. And there will be quite a lot of that. And if you look at which was published the other day, there's this Kyiv Institute in Germany that tracks support. Look at the figures there, they're quite impressive in terms of both numbers and the direction of things. And going as to public opinion, Sylvia and I are associated with something called European Council on Foreign Relations, and we do public opinion polling for some reason. But we did one big one last year and one big one this year. The last year was the anticipation that war fatigue was going to set in. There were some tendencies, not much. The one we did this year was the other way around. Support had increased all across Europe, really, for Ukraine, in every single respect, in every single part of Europe. Portugal, I mean, you could understand it in Finland and Sweden, perhaps in Estonia, but Portugal, Spain, has increased support, and that sort of sad translates into politicians. But the question was enlargement, and Sylvia alluded to that. That's going to be the big issue. And I think you will hear Ursula von der Leyen on, I think it's Wednesday, she's having her big speech, the annual speech in the European Parliament. She will, in all probability, speak quite a lot about that. And in all probability, all of the heads of state and government in December of this year is going to launch accession negotiations with Ukraine. That was unthinkable in every single respect only a couple of years ago. And it is a decision that's going to shape the European Union for the next 10 years. It is irreversible as long as Ukraine's reform and democratic course is irreversible. Every time that the European Union has opened the door, it has resulted in membership, with the exception of cases where, say, Turkey, things have turned in the other direction. But if Ukraine stays the course, it's an irreversible decision that will fundamentally shape the European politics in the next 10 years. There will be a lot of controversies over the details of it. If you don't know the details of European Common Agriculture Policy, I would advise you to stay away from it. But it's expensive and controversial. And Ukraine will enter the European Union with a very competitive agricultural sector. That's good for those of us who give priority to good and cheap food, somewhat less so for those that give priority to keeping farmers voting for you. Structural funds, and we are talking about these together, is sort of half of the European Union budget. Significant reallocation of European money, significant reallocation of European attention, but absolutely essential to bring stability to Europe in the future. And the fact that even governments that previously were, hostile to even mentioning the fact that Ukraine could be a member, that they are now on that particular bandwagon, is a recognition of the fact that if we don't assure the stability of Ukraine, this significant piece of territory in Europe, we will never have stability in Europe. And that's an amazing development that I think is going to shape European EU policies for quite some time to come. And support so far is amazingly unanimous and strong.
That is a good note to end on. We would need 3 hours to do justice to the full range of expertise and experience, not just up here, but in this room. But we'll have to stop there and continue all of this tomorrow. So please thank our speakers tonight.